Namaste. Welcome to the 4th edition of the Global Festival of Oneness, organized by Indica Moksha. My name is Anuradha, and I'm the host for today's session. Let us start with a prayer. Sadashiva Samarambham, Shankaracharya Madhyamam, Asmadacharya Paryantam, Vande Guru-Paramparam. We're very pleased to have with us Ramesh Venkatraman, who is going to talk about the topic Shankara Charitham, a modern retelling. Before we get into the session, I'd like to introduce the speaker. Ramesh ji presently works as director, Vivekananda Institute of Leadership Development, and after a 2-decade stint in the corporate world, where he held strategic and leadership positions across domains, Ramesh ji has now been engaged in the development sector for the last 5 years. Ramesh ji is also deeply invested in understanding, practicing, and disseminating the dharmic and cultural heritage of Bharat. Writing is a passion for him, and he writes regularly on a range of topics spanning culture, dharma, and management. He is in the process of authoring and publishing 2 books. One is the story of Vishnu Sahasranama, Bhishma's Reflection. And the second, which he's going to talk about today, is Shankara Charitham, a modern retelling. Welcome, Ramesh ji.
Thank you. Also want to thank Nitin and Indica Moksha, and also the my own organization, which is the Vivekananda Institute for Leadership Development and the Swami Vivekananda Movement, which have given me the opportunity to speak on this topic. I hope I'm audible to everyone. The question of a modern retelling, I think that's something that we've discussed as well.
Louder, sorry, Ramesh, you can be a little louder.
Okay, so the question is, when there is so much that is already available in terms of Shankara's life story and the many episodes that where we've his debates, his discussions. The question obviously arises: why do we need to have a retelling? And typically, when somebody says that there is a modern retelling, then typically questions like, are we trying to bring about modernism into it, or are we going to be looking at breaking away from tradition, and things like that typically come up. So I must start by telling you that when I say modern retelling, I think what I actually mean is that I felt that there was a need for the story to be retold in an idiom and language that is modern, but does not break away from the traditional accepted history, and that is of Shankara Charitham. Secondly, I also felt that there was a fair amount of hagiography that kind of ran through most of the stories that around Shankara, and there was a need for me to be able to explain this to an audience that probably relates to all of these things very differently from how an earlier audience related to it. Thirdly, there is also, I've also started to feel that there are several parallels between the society that existed during the times of Shankara and the difficulties that Dharma went through during those days and how he had to fight through, and the society that we live in, where I feel that Dharma is being attacked similarly and is in a similar situation. So these are the fundamental premises on which the retelling is happening. And it's also happening in English, which means that it'll also cater to an audience that primarily not just reads in English, but also thinks in English. That is those are the fundamental premises. So since we're going to be having 4 of these lectures, what I'm going to be doing today is to look at what is extant in terms of what is available with regard to Shankara's story, his history, and all of that. And then also look at how we can extract information from each of these material. What is the process that typically works in culling out information and also presenting that information? And finally, I'm also going to be reading probably from a few passages or paragraphs from the first 4 chapters that I've already authored on Shankara. So I'll share my screen. So in terms of what we're going to be covering today, as I mentioned, I think the first of the sections we're going to cover is we're going to look at hagiography, history, and story in terms of the connects there. Then we're going to look at, this is kind of a teaser where we're going to look at sweet, sour, and savory. What does that mean? How the Anandagiriam is probably the earliest source of Shankara's life and story. And in the process that we will need to look at in accepting validity, 2 slides on that. And then I'll probably be reading. And then I am open to also taking a few questions related to the topic and related to if there are questions on why a modern retelling is required, and if there are any other questions on when the book is going to come out. I'm open to answering those questions. I hope the slide is moving.
Yes, it's moving.
Move this. Okay.
Yeah, it's moving.
So if you look at the what is available, you could categorize it under 4 sections. The first would be the Shankara Vijayam kind series of books and manuscripts and articles and all of that would occur. So how I've categorized it is that Shankara Vijayam and under the horizontal line across all of those that are available under that series, with the exception of the Shankara Digvijaya Sara. Then there are several books and manuscripts that are available without the Shankara Vijayam title, and these are those that are available. Then you have the short commentaries. The 2 commentaries that I mentioned here are both from the Kanchi Kamakoti Matam. And then there are references across Itihasas, Puranas, and there are indications in the Vedas as well, where that an avatara of the nature of Shankara would be born and all of that. But there are 2 that are important in terms of how they cover Shankara and his advent and all of that, and that would be the Shiva Rahasyam and the Markandeya Purana. So if you look at the Shankara Vijayam series, so when I say Bruhat, it means we should be reading it as Bruhat Shankara Vijayam. So each of these books would end or will have a suffix that will say Shankara Vijayam. So then there is the Bruhat and the Prachina, which are, as the names themselves suggest, very ancient as well as old. I've marked both of them out in red because we do not have these 2 manuscripts or books that are available right now. So, but how do we know that these existed? Because you will find references to them in the Vyasachali, the Anandagiri, Madhaviya Shankara Vijayam, and all of that. They will all refer to this Bruhat Shankara Vijayam as well as the Prachina Shankara Vijayam. There is also this, sometimes people also make the argument that the Bruhat and Prachina are actually the Anandagiriya. So we will examine that as well. That the Anandagiriya Charitham is actually the Bruhat as well as the Prachina. And today, in the modern historical recording, I think it's we have come to accept that the Anandagiriya is the oldest available manuscript on the life and times of Shankara. The Vyasachaliya is also, as the name itself suggests, it's Achala. It's firm and it's extensive and also is well accepted across the board. Then you have the Chitvilasiya, the Keraliya, as the name suggests, written primarily in Kerala. And sometimes it's also, and I've drawn a box around that because it's the Govinda Nadi Charitham is also seen as probably the same as the Kerala. Then the one that has that does not end with Shankara Vijayam, but can be categorized under the same Shankara Vijayam series is called the Shankara Digvijaya Saram, which, as the name suggests, is the essence of the Shankara Digvijayam. Now, there are several manuscripts, some of them available, some not available, on without the Shankara Vijayam series, where there are several chapters or several incidents from the life of Shankara that are mentioned. There are either mentioned, there are, for example, Patanjali Charitam, you will have, because Shankara is seen as from the same lineage, you will find that there are at least 2 or 3 chapters in the Patanjali Charitam on Shankara. And the Shankara Abhyudayam is also fairly. Then you have the Sri Shankaracharya Champu, which is prose. Champu essentially is prose plus poetry. The Bhagavadpada Abhyudayam and the Bhagavadpada Saptati and the Guru Vamsa Kavyam. That is also something that both all 3, Gaudapada, Govinda Bhagavadpada and Shankara are discussed. And like I said, the short commentaries that are in the Kanchi Kamakoti Pitam. One called the Punya Shloka Manjari and the Jagadguru Ratnamala, which also talk in brief but very, very succinctly on the life and times of Shankara. In the Itihasa Puranas, like I mentioned earlier, you have the Sivarahasya and the Markandeya Purana, which both speak of Shankara and his life. So in brief, this is the landscape of what is available to us on Shankara. And as we can see, I have marked out the Madhaviya in green, primarily because it's become the most popular and the most accepted of the many biographies that are available. And we will see why that is important. But I'm also lingering on this slide a little bit because I want people also to appreciate that there is so much that is available there that it's critical that somebody actually stitch all of this together into a thread and present it in a modern idiom that people can relate to. While presenting it in a modern idiom, like I've mentioned, and I continue to repeat that it's critical that we do not, forget that we are talking about somebody who was primarily responsible for the Dharma having survived. If today we are talking of, today everybody is a dharmic warrior. We have intellectual Kshatriyas and all sorts of names and words to describe the little that many of us do in terms of trying to protect what is a rapidly dissolving and rapidly disappearing cultural foundation. We literally have the ground being cut from under our own feet. So in that situation, it's critical to understand the story and the life of somebody who at a very, very young age, and they say that the last 3 years he was a Mauna Muni, which means roughly at the age of 28 to 29 he stopped writing, discoursing, or debating, and all of that must have ended by that time. And which also means that there must have been, so which also gives you an idea of what he managed to achieve in that short period, and therefore the need to retell. And the retelling also is critical, like I mentioned, with regard to the 3 pillars, in terms of embedding it in so that it makes contextual and also current relevance to people. So it's one thing to say that we will not change an iota of anything that we have, which I completely appreciate and completely agree, and that we must not break away from tradition. And the whole idea of tradition is that it's an inheritance that we need to receive and protect. But at the same time, it also is critical that we ensure that people, the current generation, also relates to this and takes pride in it. And that is going to happen if you try to tell the story in a language that makes sense to them. So that's broadly what I want to cover. So I said it's sweet, sour, and savory, which is the Madhaviya Shankara Vijaya. And let's move this a little. Okay, so there are many reasons why it's the most popular. One is it has a great poetic beauty to it, and it extensively covers the philosophical debates and discussions, particularly the episode with Mandana Mishra and the episodes with the Buddhists, the incident where Shankara meets with Kumarila, but all of that. And it's not, and also Kumarila Bhatta's argument in the King's Court itself is covered in fair detail. And it was one of the first of the books to be published and distributed widely. 2 editions apparently were published about 150 years ago and circulated. So that is the other thing. And what is also added to its popularity is that there are 2 commentaries that have been written on it, which is one is the Advaita Rajya Lakshmi, which is the Achitraya Modak is written that, and then the Dindima Vyakaranam, which is Ganapati Suri. And it's an elaborate compilation. People often think that the Madhaviya Shankara Vijayam is story that's been written, but it is a compilation from multiple sources, and it has upwards of 2,000 verses. And the other major, the author himself says that, in stating why what his book is, he says the shlokas of the older poets are sweet. I have added the salt and the savory bits. That's Madhava's factor. Humility, where he says that and he openly. For example, in the Madhaviya Shankara Vijaya, you will have extensive sections that have been taken from the Vyasachali, which I said was probably one of the, and also the Anandagiriyam, which is probably the oldest, and Vyasachaliyam being the most elaborate. It takes extensively from them, and he makes no bones of the fact that it is drawn from these 2 primary sources. And like we saw in the earlier slide, both the Vyasachaliyam and the Anandagiriyam are often, the Anandagiriyam in particular and the Vyasachaliyam are also seen as the Bruhat and the Prachina Shankara Digvijayams themselves, and often seen as not separate. And even if they are not separate, they are probably reproductions or, in a sense, retellings that draw primarily from because both the Prachina as well as the Bruhat are not available to us. So it's only these 2 that cite and quote the Prachina. It also draws from the Shankara Abhyudhyam of Raja Chudamani Dikshita, Patanjali Vijayam Charitham, Ramabhadra Dikshita, Bhagavadpada Saptati, and all of those things also. There are several that takes from. So in that sense, it's a fantastic compilation that gives you at one source all of the stories, the incidents, and the events that kind of inform us about Shankara and his life and story. For example, if you look at one other major source which was not mentioned here, but which forms a critical part of my own writing, is the Shankara Charitham, which is a collection of discourses by the Paramacharya of Kanchi, and which appears in volume 5 of the Daivatin Quran, which is the Tamil version, and which is also available in the English called the Voice of God. And he talks extensively of it. So that itself runs into anywhere between 600 to 700 pages of writing on Shankara. So that's probably the largest source and of the compiled literature and all of the information that's available on Shankara and his. And in the Vyasachalayam itself, Vyasachala himself is very humble when he says, for example, in the beginning of the Madhavayam itself, he talks of how on the mountains of old scholars like Vyasachala, Acharya's story is an excellent tree that has grown, and the bees, the community of scholars where he includes himself. I have simply taken the material from the books, so the typos and the grammatical errors are as is, and so drink the honey in the flowers of that tree. I have tried to take the flowers, he says. Essentially what he's saying is that, people read it and they extract the honey and the essence of what is in those books. I have tried to take the flowers themselves, which is the meaning, and then, kind of retell it. But he also adds, to the extent that is physically possible for me to reach, with the pole of my small brain, meaning, that little wooden rod, whatever that is used to pluck the flowers. And I've made them into a garland, and that I'm giving as the Samkshepa Shankara Vijay. That's what he says. And for him, it's a kind of a summary. But like we saw, this itself is a fairly elaborate compilation of 2,000 verses that is available. And Govindanathar also mentions the same metaphor that he used, that Madhaviya uses in his work, Shankara Vijayam, which as I mentioned is also known as the Kerala Shankara Vijayam, meaning that it's probably written in Kerala and also draws inspiration from that region. And he says the meaning, Acharya Charitham has grown as a tall literary tree on Vyasachala. So again, if you see the primary references to Vyasachala, and like I mentioned, the Vyasachala is most probably the Brihat Shankara Vijayam as well. But the Vyasachala in its own terms refers at several places to the Brihat. I do not have the capacity to get the flowers, its meaning of the tree. As you can see, in here itself, now the Govindanath's version is older than the Madhaviya Shankara Vijayam. But if you see the commonality of the metaphors that is used, we will realize that the Madhaviya Shankara Vijayam draws extensively from all of these. So in that sense, it's a compilation, and that in no way takes away from the quality of the work or this. But like I said, the author himself is very clear that he takes from everybody, and he is but and he's not able to meet the requirements as the other authors. But he says that he's happy that he could borrow from all of them. As you can see, the metaphors are the same. And then again, Govindanathar also mentions that the Vyasachala is fortunate because he had the good fortune and the opportunity to write on somebody like Shankara. And those who know his writing are also fortunate because, like I mentioned, it is the primary source right now, or one of the primary sources from which we derive most of what we have at the moment. And the Anandagiriyam is perhaps the earliest source of Shankaras. And this conclusion is drawn primarily from the commentaries that, like I mentioned, that were written on the Madhaviyam. And the Anandagiriyam has all the details that are there in the Brihat Shankara Vijayam and the Prachina Shankara Vijayam, which have been, like I said, mentioned as the source in the Madhaviyam. And you will also find all of that in the Anandagiriyam as well. And sometimes, there is this practice of also calling the Anandagiriyam itself the Brihat Shankara Vijayam and the Prachina Shankara Vijayam. And this, the commentary, like I said, which was written by Achitraya Modak, when he talks of the last days of the Acharya, which is Shankara here, and the book is the Advaita Rajya Lakshmi, where he also, draws, like I said, the Shiva Rahasyam and the Puranas also are taken in. in the entire story of Acharya, including his having attained the attainment of Siddhi in Kanchi is primarily derived from here. And he says that all these facts have been obtained in the Anandagiri's Brihad Shankara Vijayam. So when we say we are talking of the Anandagiri Shankara Vijayam, we perhaps are also talking of the same thing as the Brihad Shankara Vijayam. So that brings into question even whether there did exist an Ananda Shankaragiri, the Brihad Shankara Vijayam itself, or is it the Anandagiri itself that was probably known through multiple names as the Brihad Shankara Vijayam, and therefore people think that there are two books when it's actually just one. So these are things that we still are not very clear on. And again, the Shankara Vijayam, so like the Paramacharya himself points out in the Devatin Pural, volume 5, page 606, and more than 90% of the details of where all Acharya went, in what order he went, whom all he had met, where all he had stayed, and for what time, mentioned in the Anandagiriyam is also mentioned in the Madhaviya Shankara Vijayam. So, and he points out that even the sentence structuring, the framing, the sentences are also more or less the same, which makes the Anandagiriyam the primary source. Which also means that when we go to the Madhaviya Shankara Vijayam, we are going to a work or a manuscript that has all of the information that is perhaps has most of the information that is available on Shankara, and therefore it's become the critical and most important source for Shankara's life, and is also valid because it quotes extensively from across all of these, and it also takes material directly from all of these earlier works that have already existed. So how do we go about the process of accepting validity? Now there are three ways that the Paramacharya talks of in the Shankara Vijayam. And he says, and the Shankara Charitham that he has, which is a compilation of all his discourses on Shankara, essentially talks of three ways in which details that tally with what is mentioned in the Itihasas and Puranas, primarily the Markandeya Purana and the Shiva Rahasyam here that we talk. And what is the commonality across the several Shankara Vijayam works? Now that the second part is already done to a large extent by Madhaviya Shankara Vijayam. Commonality and that which is common, the requirement of a compilation, the requirement for collating all of the information into one book, and all of that is primarily done by the Madhaviya Shankara Vijayam. Therefore, the critical importance. And the third thing that we need to look at is what is the prevalence and acceptability in narratives across the length and breadth of the country. Are there certain stories and anecdotes, episodes that are, common, and there are narratives that have been that people have come to accept, and therefore can have the strength. So, the three lenses or the three filters through which we pass all of the information and then, look at it are these three. What are the details what are the overlaps that occur in the two primary Itihasa Puranas that we have, the Shiva Rahasyam and the Markandeya Purana? And what is the commonality across the several Shankara Vijayam works, for which you can go to the Madhaviya Shankara Vijayam, perhaps go to a couple of other books as well, primarily the Shankara Charitham of Paramacharya. And also perhaps examine all of that and then arrive at what is the acceptable story and what is this one. Because like I mentioned, there is an element of hagiography that has been included. And, one of the critical criticisms that have been common is that many of the incidents and events are purely hagiographical. They did not happen and all that. So we must look at how we can ensure that we can also lend a lot of reality and also embed them within the, like I said, one of the critical things that I want to do is also to look at parallels or relevances that are available even in the current literature. Just to give an example of how this can be done, of how to find what variations could be acceptable and not, and which is how the stories have been written. For example, the Panchalingam's story, Shankara getting the Panchalingam. The Shiva Rahasya mentions it. But the story that comes out of it is primarily that Shiva emerges from the Vishwanatha Lingam and hands it to Shankara. If you look at the Markandeya Samhita, Acharya goes to Kailasha and receives it from Mahadeva. But the prevalent story is that Acharya received both Panchalingam and Saundarya Lahari. So there is a common thread that connects all of this, and this is that he did receive the Panchalingam. From whom? From Mahadeva himself. That nobody is disputing. Right? You could, so this is not me saying this, but it's the Paramacharya himself saying. He says, so find out what is the underlying commonality which is critical. And here what is critical is that Acharya or Shankara received the Panchalingam directly from Shiva or Mahadeva. That is the commonality. Right? Let's not argue and debate about it, Shiva emerge out of the Vishwanatha Lingam. So you take all of them, but the most important takeaway, or the most important takeaway from all of this is that Acharya received it directly from Shiva and Mahadeva. I think that critical focus needs to happen. So when we look at what is the process of accepting validity, it has to, while it passes through all of these three lenses. So I think it's also important to understand that we do not forget what is the core message that is coming out of a particular incident or a particular story, and get distracted into arguing the all of the subtleties and all of the don't get carried in by the surround sound around it. Just focus on the key, most important information. So before I go to the reading, I am okay with taking a few questions right now, or I could straight away go into to the reading.
Ramesh, you take questions at the end. Yeah.
Okay, fine. Okay, so this is from I'm going to be reading from the from chapter 1, and in the story and the retelling of Shankara, what is very clear is that Shankara was no ordinary human who was born. He was an avatara that had descended. That there is acceptance across the board in terms of that, and therefore, so how this avatara descended, what was the purpose of the avatara, why did it come, is critical for us to understand, and at the same time critical also to embed it in the current narratives of the situation that we find ourselves. So I'm going to be reading from chapter 1, section 2, which is called Parameshwara's Dilemma. When I speak of Parameshwara, I'm talking of Shiva here. And so I'll be reading from there. So this is, like I said, chapter 1, section 2 of chapter 1. It was an age of darkness, where chaos reigned supreme, and men thought it fit to do as they saw fit. Shastras were looked down upon, the authority of the Vedas was questioned, and even Bhagavan was rejected. Many people wanted to destroy all that was old and usher in a new age where anything and everything would be accepted. There is no need for any god. There is no need to practice any ritual. To progress, we will need to reject both Vaidikam and Paramatma. Of what use are they anyway? Is there anything other than the material? Therefore, make merry and live in the here and now, for there is nothing beyond. These were some of the sentiments expressed by those who lived during those times. These were not dark clouds, but the dark night of Kali itself that had descended upon Bharatavarsha and hung like a stubborn mist that wouldn't let even a ray of sunshine pass through it. Buddhism and Jainism had made deep inroads into Sanatana Dharma and appeared to have captured the minds and hearts of a large majority of the population. Perhaps the fact that it was started by royal princes who gave it all up in the quest to find themselves was the source of their attraction. Or perhaps it was just the novelty, or maybe the desire to break with the old and embrace something new. Whatever it was that motivated people to break with tradition and reject everything that gave them meaning and purpose, the fact is that it was one of the bleakest periods of our civilization, not dissimilar from the state Hindus find themselves in now. Like they say, the present times reflect the past, and we will have a moment of reckoning, as did the Hindus of that time. In short, it was a moment pregnant with import and ripe for the descent of an avatara, who would not only shoulder the burden of turning the precarious situation around, but also show the way for the times to come, who would not give only upadesha, but would also show through his acharana that he would walk the talk. And, it was also in line with the promise he had given Arjuna that he would come again and again to re-establish dharma when the needle of unrighteousness rises and that of dharma declines. And the two Bhagavad Gita quotes that are there, Yada Yada Hi Dharmasya Planir Bhavati Bharata Abhyudhan Adharmasya. And then to protect the righteous, destroy the wicked, and re-establish the principles of dharma, he would descend again and again. That is the Paritranaya Sadhuna Vinasha Dushkrita. But where I also bring in an element of difference here is also mentioned that, however, there were several differences between the time of Krishna Avatara and the time that is being discussed here. In Krishna's times, at least karma anushtana was being followed by those in the Pravriti Marga, whereas even that was being questioned and or discarded as meaningless, useless, and a waste of one's time. In the Nivritti Marga too, the goal of jnana was no longer the attainment of mukti, but rather shunya. The nothingness and neither here nor there state of Trishanku was what appeared to be more important. Finally, when Krishna spoke of Vinashaya cha Dushkrita, the wicked and the Asuric people were identifiable as specific individuals or groups. This was no longer possible because adharma had so seeped into the psyche of the society and into people's minds that a clear distinction between those who were dharmic and those who were adharmic could no longer be made with certainty. Adharma had become endemic and had spread far and wide and diffused into the very fabric of life. In a situation such as this, what sort of an avatara purusha would be best suited to handle the situation? This was Parameshwara's dilemma. So this is the section on Parameshwara's dilemma. If you look at the original work of it primarily will speak of that, the devas and and all of the devas and all of the kinnaras and all of them approached Parameshwara. I do mention that in the subsequent section, and they worshipped him and asked him to descend. Therefore, that adharma is prevalent in world and on earth, and therefore he needs to descend. So it's probably a couple of lines that would be there in the both in the Madhaviyam as well as. But as you can see, I have added to the story. So I'm adding to the story so that one, it makes for easier reading, one, and two, the critical need to also embed it in context that makes sense for the current generation, while also not forgetting that, not losing out on the primary ethos, which is that Shankara is an avatara, that he's a descendant of Shiva, and that dharma is something that needs to be practiced and not spoken of. One of the big errors that we seem to be making is that all of us can speak on it, or speak about it, or speak of it. But when it comes to actually putting it into practice, actually practicing it ourselves, we don't seem to be very keen on doing that at all. And therefore, put practice before preaching, and start with yourself, and then things will spread. Is what else? So that is the primary intent of that section of chapter 1, which was Parameshwara's dilemma. I'll just read the section 2 as of the same chapter, which is titled the Sannyasa as the Avatara Purusha. So because we ended with Parameshwara's dilemma, because till that time, you really did not have a sannyasi as an avatara. You had these fantastic avatars of Matsya, Kurma, and all. So here was somebody. So why that? And I read, as the Supreme Parameshwara pondered over this conundrum, he weighed the many options before him in choosing the mode of intervention that would best suit the context, the people, and the times. Clearly, the situation was such that it could not be a Rama Avatara or Krishna Avatara. During the Rama Avatara, when the hordes of Rakshasas descended upon Vishwamitra's Yagyashala, he could point out to the Rakshasas and ask Rama to destroy them. There was a clearer demarcation between the forces of the dark night and the forces of the light in those times. Now, this demarcation, although not yet fully erased, had become much less clear. Adharma had permeated every nook and corner like the air that enters everywhere, seeping and diffusing into everything and everyone. Take the example of Vishwamitra and consider this. What if the Rakshasa was a mind virus instead of a giant and scary physical being, and this mind virus had entered his subconscious? There, it told him constantly and badgered him to adopt the easier and more sensuous path of Adharma. What if it told him that Dharma was like a constantly changing amoeba and therefore should be altered to suit one's specific needs and made easy by deleting most of it or rejecting it in entirety? Karma anushtanas were anyway such a waste of time, so why practice it? It is all right to not do it sometimes and focus on the more important aspect of enjoying life. Furthermore, a mind virus spreads much more rapidly and insidiously, affecting a larger population than the influence of Rakshasa can wield through his efforts at instilling fear in the masses. It was in such a milieu that Parameshwara chose to descend as a sannyasi, who would show the way through Dharma Rakshana and Dharma Paripalam, whose Digvijayam would come not from the sharp blade of the sword, but through the incisiveness of his jnana, the felicity of his arguments, the strength of his Dharmanishta, and the determination of his sankalpa. So this is the second of, so I will stop here on chapter 1 and then probably read from one of the other chapters. So because here I continue with why we are writing, and most of what I covered is also mentioned in the in chapter 1, where why the Shankara of the articles that are available and what is the information that's available. So this is from chapter 4, and the chapter 4 is titled, it's called Darkness and Light. And the subtext is that when the lion roars, even the elephants retreat. This is actually a direct translation of this phrase from the Madhaviya Shankara Vijaya, where the lion is Kumarila Bhatta, and the elephants he refers to are the Buddhists and the Jains who have taken control. So this section is called when the lion roars, even the elephants retreat. And Kumarila Bhatta had walked for several weeks. I'm reading right. On the way, he had visited several temples and worshipped there, seeking the blessings of the Devas and Devis in his quest to save Dharma and re-establish the pristine truth of the Vedas. He had also engaged a few scholars in arguments and debates, and in the process, honing and sharpening his skills and debating points for the impending trial by fire that awaited him in the capital city ruled by King Sudanman. Kumarila Bhatta had one advantage over his Buddhist opponents, and he intended to use that advantage to the fullest. He had made a deep and careful study of Buddhist philosophy in addition to his deep study and practice of the Vedas and Mimamsa. In time, Kumarila Bhatta reached the capital city of King Sudanman. As was the practice of the day, he was welcomed and received with great honor and respect by the king. It did not matter that the king was a practitioner of Buddhism. The fact that Kumarila Bhatta was a scholar par excellence was enough for the king to welcome him with respect and offer him a seat of honor. It was still a time when points of difference were settled through debate and argumentation, discussion and analysis. The sword as a means to settle ideological and religious differences would come later. But for now, Viveka, discernment, was the scalpel of discernment that would be the primary means to differentiate the victor from the vanquished. Furthermore, the cancel culture that is in vogue today was unknown to the verbal combatants of the day. As Kumarila sat on the throne of honor, he realized that in honoring him, the atmosphere for a debate and a contest of wits was being nullified. This would mean the failure of his mission. He realized that he would have to say or do something provocative to start the debate, and that is exactly what he did. At that precise moment, an Indian cuckoo, kokila or koil, started its characteristic call, a kuhu, kuhu, kuhu call that is repeated in the crescendo 5 or 6 times. Kumarila immediately seized on this opportunity to fire his first salvo. He seemingly addressed the cuckoo, but his words were aimed at the king and the Buddhist monks assembled there. He said, "O Kokila, how beautiful and sweet to the ears is your voice. Your sweet music would have been heard by all assembled here, but for the disturbance caused by the cawing cacophony of the crows." He had called the Buddhists crows, and that naturally angered them, which is exactly what he wanted. And so again, here you will find that in terms of how this is covered, most of it would be briefly covered, and whereas here I would detail. I would take a lot more time in terms of expanding the story, and in expanding the story, you will realize that there is also an element of the bringing in the aspect of one, like one is obviously I wanted to ensure that people have an immersive experience of what could have happened, which required the to let the imagination run. Again, with the caveat, and I keep adding this caveat because this is a criticism that is well made and often made. In fact, with most modern writers that exist today, who tend to go overboard in terms of dissing or dismissing most of what is considered dharmic, and therefore I'm being very careful to ensure that I do not take away from it. But the element of storytelling is critical, because you cannot simply state facts and then expect people of this current generation to be able to get engrossed in the reading of it, because I think it's critical that we draw in the present lot using the instruments that are available to us right now, and that in itself is viveka, that is discernment, not force-fitting our narratives and saying this is what it is and therefore don't ask questions and simply follow. But how do you package it in a way that you do not dilute dharma even a whit, but at the same time you also ensure that the present generation is able to relate to it? I think that is a critical need, and like I said, this is just an attempt at that. It's just an effort, an attempt at that, and hopefully it would work out. So I will read from one more before I think we have 10 minutes more, therefore. This is from the chapter 2, sorry, and it's called Mahadeva. Chapter 2 is called Mahadeva's Petition, and then Shivaguru and Aryamba become the vehicles of the divine descent. This is section 2 of chapter 2, which is titled the Dual Petition. We saw in chapter 1 how the, Parameshwara's dilemma was discussed. So here we talk about the dual petition. As we observe as we observe the avatars and their progression over time, we see how each of the avatars reflect closely the dynamics of the time and the context in which they are required to descend. Parashurama had to wield his axe mercilessly to mete out justice and preserve dharma. Rama, on the other hand, could afford to set the example of being the Maryada Purushottam. Krishna was more comfortable exhibiting the human side of his personality, including his foibles, but then was equally at ease in displaying his supreme personality when required. Shankara Avatara also was a reflection and response to the times. While we'll come to this later, it is important to recognize this in order to appreciate the true purpose of each avatara. Furthermore, when we reflect upon the avatars, one realizes that many of these avatars are a result of and in response to two petitions. One, when the Devas and Dikpalas, vested with the responsibility of Lokakshema, find themselves losing control and no longer able to discharge their duties to the fullest, they approach the Supreme Being for help. This typically happens when they are in the presence of and or the world has been taken over by a being or a force that is way more powerful, and they require the support and or the intercession of the Supreme Being itself or an amsha of the Supreme Being, an avatara. Two, a coming together of circumstances where a couple living in Bhuloka attain to a state of perfection after long years of sadhana over several lifetimes and become the perfect vehicles to carry the seed of the divine and bring it into the world. When such a couple petitions the Supreme Being, then the Supreme Being decides to enter the world through them for the greater good of the world, i.e. Lokakshema. As adharma had seeped into every nook and corner of the world, the Devas and Dikpalas had come together and reached the icy peaks to meet and petition the one without a second, he who is the very epitome of all auspiciousness, Shiva, the Devadideva and Mahadeva. They had one goal, to appraise him of the situation in Bhuloka and seek his help and intervention in putting things back in order. They spoke to him thus, quote, Mahadeva, the world is filled with the fraudulent and the heterodox. They neither practice nor have they any respect for the eternal Vedas that emerged out of your own nostrils. They indulge in carping criticism of the rules of dharma, of varna and ashrama. They say these are merely superstitious nonsense that prevent them from living a life of their choosing. Furthermore, there is none who performs the sandhya, and the mere utterance of the word yajna makes them cup their ears with their hands. If no one performs the yajnas, how will we, the devas, get our offerings that we depend on to keep us going? Mahadeva, and that is not all. They heap humiliation and insult on the Vedas, which is a direct insult to you. And there is no limit to the perversities that they indulge in. All our efforts at putting things back in order have come to naught. We seek your intervention now, or else everything shall be lost. As Mahadeva gently opened his eyes, the Devas and the Dikpalas waited with bated breath. For in this response rested the future of Dharma. The earth itself seemed to have stopped in her tracks. So I'm going to end here and probably it's possible to take a couple of questions.
Thank you, Ramesh. That was an excellent overview on Shankara's, some aspects of Shankara's life and the great amount of biographies and work that has been written about him in all sorts of literature. We have a couple of questions and we'll take one of them. Okay, one of the person says that, the background, as you have indicated, is that there was a lot of adharma and there was a degradation of practices. But according to this person, even Buddhism actually only teaches dharma. So where is this adharma coming from in that sense? And what exactly is the issue there,
This is the second question, is this? These readings being to be.
The first, it's actually, I just combined the two because they're quite long and he goes into great details. But the essence of that is basically this, that even basically the Buddhism is also about dharma, and the Shunya is also trying to understand the same as Brahman, perhaps. That's what he's trying to convey. So what is so...
I think, although this is, the answer would be a long question, and I'm no expert on Buddhism. I think the questioner must understand two things. One, I am being honest to the original works that are there. So when I retell what is mentioned there. So the persons who wrote this across the board, some of them were probably, written 100 years after Shankara. And then, Shankara, you should not go only by the Madhaviyam and say that that is the only. So in that sense, to answer the first part of the question is that I am reflecting, I am the mirror for the writer of those times. They have said this about Buddhism, and therefore I have to be faithful to what they said, and therefore I'm saying it. That is the first part of it. The second part of it is that while Buddhism also talks of Dhamma and Dharma, the Dhammapada is essentially the path of Dharma, the path of Dharma. I think critically the rejection of a supreme being as the fundamental or the ultimate is in essence a deviation from them. Shunyata is not a state where you are one with Brahman. So the whole idea of Advaita Vedanta is that there is a possibility for you to merge in the ultimate reality that is there. And I'm reminded of a very, very nice story that I heard in the Ramakrishna Ashrama. It used to be called the Vivekananda Ashrama earlier in also Bangalore. It's now called the Ramakrishna Ashrama. And two monks who have now become heads of the Belgaum Ashrama, Shankar Maharaj, and Shankar Maharaj was there, and so we were, and they were talking of, so how do you understand Advaita Vedanta? And he was talking of a glass of water, which there's water right up to the half of the glass is filled with water, and there's a droplet that is coming down the rim of the glass. And he says you're separate as long as you are the drop and the supreme being is there. Once the drop is, once that droplet of water is fallen into that vast ocean of the supreme, it becomes one with the supreme, and it does not. How do you separate the drop from it? That is the whole idea of our understanding of the supreme reality and what it means to be to understand or the Advaitic oneness, which is not the same as how the Buddhists see it. That is one. Second, I think it was also critical that at that stage, I mean, we know, for example, that King Sudanvan himself was one of the most popular kings. In fact, Sudanvan is seen as an avatar of Indra Deva himself, had converted to Buddhism. Vast swathes of the land were essentially Buddhist and Jain practitioners. It was critical for Dharma to be clawed back from this. Sanatana Dharma, which is the eternal Dharma, is not something that could be lost just because, we have Buddhism. Nobody is saying that Buddhism is adharmic. The word adharmic should not be seen as evil. That the Dharma essentially means that you follow a particular path, which is the path of Sanatana Dharma. To be adharma is to stray away from that path. For example, I am not evil if I do not practice Sandhya Vandana, right? But that does not mean, but I am adharmic. There's no two ways about it. So.
I think we are now running out of time. So that's, this is a great debate, and we can have several sessions on this. But thank you once again, Ramesh ji, for that wonderful glimpse into Shankara's life and how biographers have looked at him in the past.
Okay, so I'll just answer this. I think your last sentence regarding prevalent status was from which source?
Yeah,
It's all
the same
taken from
thing,
the same sources that I
Yeah.
already mentioned.
which you actually explained. And of course, he's praised
Yeah.
your presentation, which is great. Okay, so
Okay,
viewers, we have
thank you.
many such presentations coming up. Later in the evening, we have The Spirituality of Advaita by CSR Prabhu. That's at 7 p.m. India time. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ramesh ji, for this wonderful presentation. Namaste and goodbye.
Thank you.